Hey Redditors, settle down, get comfy, because this is about to be a long ride. I found out my wife had been cheating on me for about 4 years, and even went as far as to leave our son in the hospital just so she could go have fun with her affair partner. My world and everything I had believed in came crashing down. Of course I couldn't let it go, so I decided to ruin her life and make her regret ever cheating. I am 33M, and my wife Nina is 32F. We've been married for 12 years, so a long time. We have 2 kids, Star, who is 12F, and Neo, who is 6M. My wife and I met at her cousin's wedding when she was 19 and I was 20. It was love at first sight. You know that feeling you get when you meet someone for the first time and you just know that you're going to spend the rest of your life with that person? Yes, that was what I felt when I saw Nina, even though we were really young and we got married a year later after she got pregnant with our daughter Star. I always knew I was going to marry Nina, so when she said she was pregnant, I didn't mind. In fact, I was happy. Becoming a father is one of the biggest joys I ever experienced. My parents, on the other hand, weren't happy, and they thought that she had baby-trapped me. I didn't listen to my parents and brush them off, because I knew my parents as proud, upper-class people. I say upper-class because that's what my parents like to call themselves. LOL. I come from generational wealth, and Nina does not. So my parents believed that if I were ever to get married, I would get married to someone from an upper-class family. My parents also believed that Nina had baby-trapped me because I had told them Nina and I were really surprised when she had gotten pregnant. She had an IUD, but we brushed it off because we knew that an IUD wasn't 100% guaranteed. My parents, on the other hand, were adamant about the fact that she had baby-trapped me. They believed she was after the money, and I laughed it off and called them crazy. I'm an only child, and so I stand to inherit everything. Looking back now, I realize my parents were right, and if I could turn back the hands of the clock, I would have listened to them. My parents, though, refused to have anything to do with the wedding unless Nina sent a prenup to avoid arguments in case. It was not a big deal, and she willing signed. We had a destination wedding because it had always been Nina's dream. I was more of a low-key person. There's this nonchalance that comes with being born in wealth, I guess. I had gotten used to it, and it no longer turned my head. Life had been that way right from the day I was born, so why would it freak me now? Nina, on the other hand, came from a poor home, so she wasn't really used to it. She wanted a big wedding, and that was what we had. I didn't really care as long as she was happy, and so I went ahead with whatever she wanted. My parents paid for the wedding because Nina and I couldn't afford it, as we were both still students. Despite the fact that my parents disliked Nina, I had already made up my mind to marry her, and they had no choice but to attend and pay for the wedding, as it was either they paid or I would pay for it out of my trust fund, and they didn't want that. My parents believed that if I paid for it out of my trust fund, I would blow away all the cash. It was a funny and absurd thought, because my trust fund held millions. I was what you would call a trust fund baby LOL. But anyways, our wedding went on. Apart from the occasional snide remarks from Nina's parents and family, who felt that my parents and family members were proud, and then eventually a full-blown quarrel between them, LOL, the marriage went on without hitch. The first few years of marriage, Nina and I busied ourselves with college and taking care of our daughter Star, and after we graduated, things eased up a bit. I started working for my dad and was earning close to 7 figures a year that made me the sole provider in the house, which I didn't mind. Nina didn't want to be a full-time housewife, and so she got a really flexible job at a locally owned business that paid well and also allowed her time for the kids. One night while we were getting ready for bed, Nina approached me and said she wanted to talk about something sensitive. I told her to go ahead, and then she broached the topic of threesomes. I was shocked as that was something we had both discussed and agreed that we would never involve ourselves in. We had both agreed that we would never involve ourselves in it, as we didn't want the fear that our partner was cheating on us with the other person behind my back. Besides, our sex life was very active, and so there was no need for that, or so I thought. Nina then told me she already had someone in mind and that she thought it would be a good experience for us. I asked her who she had in mind, and she mentioned Jason, a friend of hers who was at our wedding. He was a high school friend of hers. He and Nina were close, but not overly close, as to invoke jealousy, or so I thought, LOL. She told me he was bisexual and that she thought he would be down for it. I reminded her of our agreement and that I didn't want to involve myself in that, as I felt it wouldn't go down well for our marriage. I noticed that she was very sad about my refusal, but I didn't think too much of it. She nodded and told me that she had just wanted to try broaching the topic with me, and that she wouldn't force me. She told me that anytime I changed my mind, she would be able to talk to him. I told her that I didn't think I would ever change my mind, and she said that was also fine, and the conversation ended. About a month ago, my wife was at work, and I also was at work. Our kids were home with the nanny. My son has a severe peanut allergy, so he can't eat anything like whole peanuts, peanut butter, peanut oil, processed foods that were made with peanuts, stuff like that. So we generally try to avoid them. Ironically, my daughter has a liking for peanut, and so she tends to keep her snacks locked in a mini fridge in her room, so my son doesn't have access to them. My son knows not to eat peanuts, but he might not know if a processed food or chocolate and sweets contains traces of peanuts, so again, better safe than sorry. According to the story the babysitter and my kids told me about what happened, my daughter took a chocolate snack that contained traces of peanuts in them and was eating it. However, she got distracted when the nanny called her over to help with something. And so my daughter kept the snack in the main fridge so she would pick it up again after she was done. My son had gone to the fridge searching for a snack and had stumbled upon it. And then he ate it as he really liked chocolate. Plus, there's no rule in the house against eating others' leftover snacks in the fridge, as everyone is cool with it. He started having a severe allergy reaction, anaphylaxis, and for some reason unknown to me, his EpiPen was nowhere to be found. Trust me, I was shell-shocked when I heard it, as we usually stack up on EpiPens just in case. Anyways, the babysitter immediately called the ambulance, and then she and my daughter accompanied it to the hospital. The babysitter knows that my wife works more flexible hours than me, and that for an emergency, my wife is usually the first to be called. She called my wife. My wife came to the hospital and left. According to what the babysitter told me, she has called my wife for hours without her picking. And then when my wife picked and came to the hospital to check up on our son, she muttered something about it not being serious enough, and then told the babysitter that she had serious work to do, and then left them in the hospital. The babysitter was a temporary one for a few hours, as our nanny was feeling under the weather. It was about time for the babysitter to leave, as she had initially told us that she couldn't babysit for the whole day today. As a result of that, she was dumbfounded that my wife had left her at the hospital with no directions on what to do, and so she called me. I was in a meeting that was about rounding up, so I couldn't pick her first call. But I called back as soon as I could once it ended, which was about 5 minutes later. She sounded so relieved when I picked and filled me in on what happened. When I asked her about my wife, she told me my wife had said it wasn't serious and had left. I was surprised, as my wife wasn't usually like that. I immediately went to the hospital to pay the babysitter and pick up my kids. Of course, I made sure to tip the babysitter. The doctor said my son's reaction wasn't severe, as they had called an ambulance on time, and that he was free to leave after a routine checkup. That was soon done, and we left. On our way home, I dropped by my wife's workplace to check in on her. So imagine my surprise when her boss told me my wife had clocked out hours ago claiming an emergency. Inwardly, I was shell-shocked. Why had my wife clocked out of work, I wondered. I would have understood if I had met her at the hospital, but if it wasn't our son's allergy, then what was the emergency? I immediately became worried, because I assumed that my wife must have been feeling under the weather, and that must have made her clock out and go home. So folks, imagine my surprise when I found out that my wife was not at home, and when I called her phone, she told me she was at work. I immediately became suspicious. I decided not to call her out on her lie and tell her that I had just left her workplace 30 minutes ago. I had a feeling that if I called her out, she would just cover it up with another lie. And so I pretended as if I knew nothing, briefed her on what the doctor had said about our kid when she asked, and then told her I was waiting for her to come home. When my wife came home, I acted as if nothing was wrong. We joked, laughed, and ate dinner together, then put the kids to bed. We talked before she went to bed, as I told her I had to work late, and she was okay with it because it was something I did sometimes. I waited for her to fall asleep, and in the meantime, I played games on my laptop in my office. Then after a few hours, when I was sure she was asleep, I went to our room and took her phone. Unlocking her phone was easy, as we knew each other's passwords. Looking back now, I realized that my wife had given me no reason to doubt that she was cheating. She covered up everything so well, from giving me reasonable lies about her absences to making sure I had all the passwords and access to all her devices, so I would never suspect she was hiding something. My wife was smart, but I was smarter. I unlocked her phone with her password and checked everything from her WhatsApp to her iMessage to her photos. I went through every texting app on her phone that I knew she used regularly. At first, I ignored Facebook because it wasn't something my wife used regularly. She used it sparsely to check updates on her old high school friends and distant family members, and also to make sure that people that didn't have her number or Gmail could reach her, like say an old high school buddy looking reconnect. But realizing I had checked everything and I couldn't find anything or any evidence of her cheating or planning anything, I decided to check her Facebook, and on opening it, I realized there was an app lock on it. I was immediately suspicious, and my sixth senses were tingling. Why was there an app lock on her Facebook when there wasn't any app lock on her other apps? I also didn't know the password to the app lock, and I couldn't even guess it. The security question was also one I didn't know the answer to. The security question was a single question. It said, when is his birthday? Whose birthday? I wondered. I tried my birthday, our son's birthday, her dad's birthday, and even her granddad's birthday, all to no avail. I couldn't guess who this his was. Just as I was on the verge of giving up, I remembered something. My wife had an iPad that she used to use, and her Facebook was probably still logged in the iPad. She had gotten a new iPad and had given it to our kids, but I didn't remember her ever logging out her stuff out of the iPad. In fact, her old Gmail was still logged in on the iPad. Deciding to wait for the next day, I waited for my wife to go to work and my kids to school. Then I searched for the iPad. After she had gotten the new one and then gave the iPad to the kids, our kids had eventually discarded it when they got a new one. Regardless of that, the iPad was still fully functional, so I booted it back on and charged it. After waiting for the iPad to charge for a while, I unlocked it and checked Facebook. I was right, her Facebook was still logged in on it. I immediately went to check her chats. And that was when my word came crashing down. My wife was cheating on me with a high school friend of hers called Jason. The same Jason she had suggested we do the threesomes with. Now it's all made sense. There were tons and tons of messages, dating back as far as months ago. My wife had been in a relationship with this guy for a very long time. There were tons of messages between them mocking me, mocking Jason's wife, who was also pregnant. My wife had also been giving this guy money. She had been rejoining money from our drinks accounts and giving it to this guy. I also saw messages of them arranging meeting points, most of the time when my wife had told me she was going on a girl's trip. It was all a plot to go meet with this guy and spend time with him. My wife had even revealed to the guy that the only reason she got with me in the first place was because of the money and that she had baby-trapped me. My world had come crashing down. I was shocked and on the verge of tears. My wife that I loved so much that I also thought loved me. I thought we were the perfect couple. Of course, no one on earth is perfect, but we complemented each other so well. We understood each other, we communicated well. Everything was going so good, we genuinely enjoyed spending time with each other. So why was she doing this, I wondered. Our sex life was great, and she wasn't under any stress at work. She worked a very flexible job, and I was the sole provider of the household. She didn't pay any bills. I let her use her salary for whatever she wanted, and not even her salary, but also any amount she wanted to take from our joint account. In fact, my wife was very frivolous, but I entertained her because I knew she didn't have much growing up, and this was her trying to compensate for it. I was going on a downward spiral. I kept reading the messages even though they kept hurting me because I wanted to hear everything she had said. At one point, something in me broke, and I realized that I would make sure she regretted this. Taking screenshots of as much messages as I could, I did just that and sent them to my phone. I decided to wait for a few more weeks and gather more evidence, and also wait till they decided to meet again, so I would show up at their meeting point and surprise them. My wife came home in the evening, and I acted as if everything was fine. I pretended as if I hadn't just found out that she had been cheating on me for a long time and had even been burning my money on the guy. No wonder she has suggested the threesomes. She had wanted a way to weasel Jason into our lives so she could be with him and not feel guilty. I pretended as if I was happy to see her and acted as if I didn't want to throw up and show her the text messages and ask her to explain herself. She was clueless and didn't even suspect a plan, and the first stage was in motion. I found a steady rhythm, using the iPad to take screenshots of their adulterous conversation and send them to my phone, and then deleting all traces of them from the iPad. I then got my lawyer to draft divorce papers that I would serve her with. It didn't even take them up to a week before they were planning to meet again. They decided to meet up at a hotel, and that was the thing that brought the second phase of my plan into motion. Up until that time, I had taken a few weeks off work by telling my dad I had a family emergency. I hadn't specifically told him what had happened because I knew my father would laugh in my face and read me the I was right act. He would reiterate that multiple times, and I knew that he would always bring it up in the future. I, however, didn't tell Nina about the weeks I had taken off of work. I faked a cold in the morning and told her I would stay home and rest and work for home when I felt better. The kids were off to school too. I stayed at home and monitored their conversation through the iPad and took screenshots up until when Nina arrived at the hotel before him and booked the hotel room. She then told him the hotel room's number she was in, so he would head up to meet her without even asking at the front desk. I took more screenshots of the conversation and kept the iPad in my office. I then went to my printer and printed out a lot of the screenshots on physical paper and photocopied a lot of copies. I kept some in a huge brown envelope and held some in my hands. I drove to the hotel and headed up to the hotel room. I didn't even need to ask them at the front desk because I already knew the room number from their conversation on Facebook. I got to the room and then knocked on the door. Jason answered from inside, asking who it was, and I told him it was room service. He said he hadn't ordered doom service, and I told him it was complimentary room service. I guess he must have decided that there was no harm in answering because he came up to the door to answer. The shock on his face was worth recording. He was shirtless, and all he had on was a towel. On seeing me, his jaw has dropped wide open, almost comically LOL. I heard my wife's voice asking him what was wrong, and so I pushed him to the side softly so my wife would see it was me. She was lying on the bed and was only covering herself with the duvet. She was obviously naked under. When she saw me, she almost turned to stone. One would have thought I was Medusa with the way she froze LOL. I noticed I was on the verge of a breakdown, and so I threw the printouts of their conversations that I had held in my hand at them and left. I left in such a hurry that my wife didn't even regain her senses enough to chase after me. Before she could do that, I was already almost out of the hotel. I headed down to my car and cried for a solid 30 minutes. I'd had a few days to prepare for this, but nothing could ever truly prepare you to see this. I had thought I was over the grief and betrayal, but just seeing it physically broke me. I felt invalid and not enough. I inwardly resolved to make my wife and Jason's life a living hell. I drove home, and the moment I got home, I called my parents and asked them if they would be able to babysit the kids in such short notice because they didn't live far from the kids' school. I explained everything that has happened to them, but made them promise not to tell anybody now because I wasn't yet ready to tell anybody. My parents were understood and accepted to babysit. They understood that I must be going through a lot emotionally now. My dad even pipped in that he would gloat about how he was right, but only after I had grieved and gotten over the hurt. I immediately packed enough clothes and stuff to last the kids for a few weeks and called the driver to come pick them up. My kids didn't follow the school bus, and they were picked up every day by our driver. I gave the luggages to the driver and instructed him to pick up the kids from school once they closed and drop them at my parents' house. I knew that that wasn't really cool, as my kids would be very confused, but I resolved that I just needed to get through this week, and I would go get them the next week and explain everything to them in a way they would understand. In a few hours, Nina came home crying and begging and pulling out the waterworks. She was begging me, saying that we would get through this together. To which I told her she was delusional. I told her I wanted her out of the house, but not before I went upstairs and got the divorce papers. I sat her down and told her we could do this two ways. One, we could go to court and fight it out, or two, she could sign the divorce papers and all would be well. If she chose the first option, I would make sure I exposed her and Jason to everybody, including Jason's wife, and even Jason's boss and my wife's boss. I would also make sure I tell every single family member of each of our families. But if she chose the second option, I would not tell anybody. And if anybody asked me why we divorced, I would simply tell them that we had grown apart. She was shocked. She said she didn't want divorce at all and wanted us to talk it out. But I told her that was out of the table and that that wasn't happening even if a miracle occurred. She must have realized that I was serious because she told me to tell her the terms of the second option. She knew she would be in serious trouble if I told anybody. I smiled. The terms were simple. I would get child custody, and if she were to get visitation rights, it would be supervised visit. I was pretty sure supervised visits would not hold in court because she was not a criminal at all and did not face any danger to the kids. But I was still willing to try. If supervised visits didn't hold, then she could get weekends. She would get no alimony or anything from me. We already had a prenup in place, so I wasn't really worried about how properties were going to be shared. I inwardly thanked my parents for the first time ever for insisting on a prenup. She was in tears. She spent the next 5 minutes trying to convince me, saying it was a mistake. She didn't mean it. She told me every excuse under the sun, but it was obvious I wasn't buying it. I told her to sign the divorce paper, but she refused, so I told her to leave the house. I didn't care if she refused to sign the divorce paper because I knew she would eventually cave in. That was how it always was. I know she will spend a few days thinking and trying to convince me, and then when she kills see that I am adamant about the divorce, she will finally sign it. In the meantime, I have kicked her out. I gave her 5 minutes to pack her stuff and then told her to get out. She asked me what I would tell the kids, and I told her that I knew what to tell the kids and not to worry because I wouldn't tell the kids about her cheating. So yeah, here I am right now, alone at home, crying and drowning my sorrows with a bottle of wine. I honestly don't know what to do anymore, so I decided to come on Reddit to see if anyone had had a similar experience or something. I feel as if someone has pulled out the rock under my feet, as if everything I knew has been a lie. I honestly do not know where to go from here, but I'm trying my hardest to be strong.